Good evening. This is Sharif Awad from Ontario International Film Festival. Tonight, I am very happy to welcome Mr. Xavier Mendik and Mr. Philip Escott. They are the co-directors of Quiet Revolution that was screened this morning. Actually, a moment ago on eventive.org and the festival site. Good evening.
Good evening.
I want to first to know from you what drove you to research and present a documentary on Canadian horror films.
I'll start and maybe bring Philip in. I mean, this is one of a series of films we've done, and I guess that the unifying thread is the way in which cultures in crisis can produce socially incisive cult movies. So we've done a previous work in progress documentary on Canadian film, looking at 1970s Canadian film. Then we've done one on 1970s terrorist fears in Italian cult film. And working with Philip, we returned to this. So we wanted to return to the theme of something going on in Canadian society that provokes this decade-long series of films. But we actually wanted to work with industry figures, which is why we chose to work with Philip, because he has an established reputation in this field.
Yes. Yes, and Philip, tell me about how did you start to conceive the documentary?
Well, it was actually very, very easy. It was a case of asking Xavi who knew more than us about Canadian horror films. Because Xavi and I, we know a lot about Canadian horror films, but there's others out there who know a lot more than us, and that's where Ernest came in. And Ernest kind of changed the game. He stepped the project up. And with Ernest on board, it was a lot easier to understand Rogers Mike's governance came in. So, yeah, with Ernest on side, it was a lot easier to actually navigate the documentary.
Yes. The beginning of the documentary, it presents, a little bit of history, about the social and political situation in Canada. And it was very interesting to see, about the challenges of freedom of speech and artistic expressions. How do you think that bit by bit, filmmaking started to get free of this kind of censorship in the 70s, particularly in Canada?
Well, yeah, it's a good question. And to be honest, I think it all started where all things start, is with sex. So there was a big repression in Canadian society during that era. And there was an undercurrent in the youth culture that decided that sex was okay, and that sort of filtered through the culture and into the arts, and then through the arts it kind of led into the mainstream, and from there it was game on.
Yes.
I think, I totally agree with what Philip is saying. I mean, if you look at all of the documentaries we've done, the sort of key pivotal year tends to be 1968, whether it's what's going on in Canada with the Quiet Revolution in Montreal and the idea of Quebecois culture reevaluating itself and reevaluating sexuality in line of new freedoms, or whether it's Europe looking at student revolution and claims for sexual equality. So there's definitely something there in that era that filtered through into these movies. And what's fascinating is often there were co-productions as well between cultures in crisis. So you could have two different cultures, one Canadian, one European, or two European cultures, both have inner turmoil and social strife. And they sort of create these films, again, that have their own currency of discontent. So I guess what we're saying in the documentary is there's a lot more going on in these movies and just dismissing them as tasteless entertainment. There's definitely a lot more going on there.
What was also this kind of censorship imposed on important films coming from outside of Canada as well at that time?
Well, if you look at in the first 50-60 minutes of the documentary, I mean, the documentary moves between three Canadian spheres. It moves from looking at Montreal to then Toronto and then later Vancouver with more recent filmmakers like the Soska sisters. I guess in terms of films coming into Canada in that period of the sexual revolution, I mean, distributors like Cinepix were really key because they were distributors in Montreal, so they had a handle on films that they could distribute, often daring European films. So I think their role was really key in bringing films into the province and then using that as a way of kind of creating their own daring content for Canadian audiences.
Yeah, I agree. They were the bad boys, weren't they? They were kind of like bringing in the edgy material to push on Canadian society.
Yes, and what was interesting for me to watch, I think Cinepix was also beforehand. I don't know if I compare it to other horror productions, like Hammer in England, maybe, or Fangoria. What do you think what was special about their criteria in production and distribution, and what did bring later on in Canadian films, especially horrors?
Well, I think Cinepix were truly original. There's been no one like them. I mean, they are the trailblazers. They are the type of production company that filmmakers dream to work with. They were that perfect balance between commerce and art. So they understood that what they were making needed to make money, but they understood that the people making the material that will make them money had to have free reign. And they were like that perfect balance and that symmetry that was like, okay, I'm going to give you X amount of dollars to go and make a movie, but it has to have X, Y, Z in order for me to make my money. And yeah, I can't compare them to anyone really. I mean, they're so unique. They're so of their own entity. And Xavier, what do you think, man?
Well, I think I think I totally agree with you. I mean, they are incomparable. If there was a comparison to be made, and we interviewed for the work in progress that came before this. We interviewed Andre Link, who was one of the co-founders of Cinepix, and he sort of wryly said, we were often called the Roger Cormans of Canada. So there was absolutely no one like him in Canada. And if there were comparisons, it would be people like Roger Corman in the US. And I think Roger Corman's an interesting comparison to make. So as with Cinepix, low budgets, but the filmmakers were given free reign. And as with Roger Corman, what Cinepix pioneered was they mentored a whole generation of new Canadian filmmakers. There would be no David Cronenberg, to name just one person, but they mentored a whole generation of filmmakers. And gave them free reign. And I think, as with Roger Corman, it's no surprise Roger Corman's films have been the subject of feminist reevaluation. And people have argued that although they're working within the grindhouse domain, there's something quite subversive about them. And I think it's definitely the same for Cinepix films. They weren't any clear moral messages in these movies, and they were open for interpretation.
Yes. But right now, I want to ask both of you about how do you see right now the current status of horror, psychological thrillers, genre film, science fiction in Canada? Because I think during the last year we saw a lot of, especially American productions, either television series or films. Coming to shoot in Canada, but what about Canadian production itself? How do you see it, let's say, in the last couple of decades?
I'll start, and maybe, I mean, Philip runs a festival, I run a festival, so we're always looking at new trends and trying to identify what the new trends are.
Yes.
And Philip, I'm sure, will have his own interpretation of this. I think one of the interesting things is that Canadian horror cinema now is much more explicitly dealing with issues of ethnicity and diversity. You know, so the sort of Native American focus of Canadian film, which has traditionally been seen in documentary or realist film, is much more genre laden now. And as you saw in the tail part of the final part of the documentary, there's a whole new generation of Indigenous filmmakers who are making great waves. There's a whole new generation of diaspora filmmakers who have come into Canada from other regions. And that's the kind of thing I think we're seeing for my own festival, and I'd be intrigued to hear what Philip thinks. I mean, all of the submissions for Cinepix, my festival this year, have been from female directors or directors of colour. So there's something really fascinating here, and you can say, well, maybe it's the anger of the Me Too movement or the rage around Black Lives Matter. They're not brutal films as such. There's a kind of eloquence and beauty about them, but within a genre template. So that's at least what we're picking up from the festival submissions that are coming in. I don't know if you're finding the same, Phil, for your festival.
Yeah, I've been seeing a lot of Canadian content, like a lot, and it is diverse. There is a lot of Indigenous content. There's a lot of female content. There's a lot of content, especially the horror genre, coming from Canada. I mean, last year I went to Fright Fest just to be there for the Rabid premiere. The world premiere of Rabid was there. Xavier was there as well. But during that festival, I mean, was that 5 days? There was probably about 15 to 20 Canadian movies there. And I mean, they program 60 to 70 films over those 5 days. And that's a huge chunk of Canadian content taking up that time. And I think that just speaks quantity to how much material is coming out of Canada right now.
Yes. I have a question here from one of the viewers. How did you collect the old material for this documentary, and how you handle the copyrights? I mean, also in the documentary, what I wanted to ask you as well, because most of the material provided were from film trailers, correct?
Correct,
is it expensive to get some real clip? And how did you service, trailers? How did you manage to get it for the editing process?
Well, a lot of material from Cinepix came from them directly, so that was okay. They gave us full permission to use their archives.
Yeah.
But when it comes to trailers, that does help because it's public domain. They put it out there for us to exploit. But if you did want to go down the route of licensing actual footage, that can cost around about £5,000 per minute.
Yes. Yes. What can you tell us about each festival you are organizing? What are the current trends and selection, and how do you see the new generation of filmmakers?
Well, for Cinepix, I mean, Cinepix now has been going for 14 years, and initially it was developed to promote an MA in cult film that I developed at a university in London, and sort of then went on and had its own life beyond that. As I said previously, I think the key difference is just the amount of content from new female filmmakers, Indigenous filmmakers, and filmmakers of colour, and just the way in which it's a different kind of filmmaking, than I think previous genre patterns that we're used to. There's a real depth and intelligence and intensity to it. I still feel these are very political films, but then it's a different kind of politics that we're seeing as demonstrated through these movies. So that I think is really exciting. I think we're on the verge of some really fascinating new trends.
Yes. Philip?
No, I fully agree. And after seeing something like Spiral, did you guys catch Spiral recently? It's kind of the gay equivalent of Get Out.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Like only cut from Canada. And that's all you need to know about North American filmmaking.
Yes. I want to ask you both, do you notice that there is a rise in short films, horror short films right now? Because I think audience maybe know broadly about feature films screened or made for television, but what about horror short films? Do you think they are quite produced in a good number?
Yeah, I love short films. I mean, that's how most filmmakers get their start making features is through short films. And if one thing I know about filmmakers is they will always make short films, and God bless them. And yeah, there's been no let-up during the pandemic even of short films. And
Yes.
it's the one sort of medium that will never recession-proof. It will never cease.
I'd agree. I mean, one film that I have been watching, in a capacity is I don't know if it's had a release in Canada yet, but it's a very interesting film called Deathsember. So it's Philip probably is aware of this already. It's basically lots of different directors. Sorry, Phil?
I've seen all 2 hours of it.
Yeah, it's actually just different filmmakers of different nationalities taking a very dark satirical look at the idea of Christmas, and of course Canada gave us Black Christmas, so what more perfect territory to talk about this, but they're so it's like a compendium of just short stories and some real innovation there, and again a really nice different diverse range of directors. So I think shorts are really powering at the moment, and again very different kinds of movies that they're producing, different kind of messages.
Yes, I remember as well an American film. I think I saw the two parts VHS. I think you have seen it. They were very good anthologies, very, very well made as well, and I think several filmmakers became feature films director later on. Right now, yes. So, Xavier, I want to ask you about the courses you teach yourself. As a professor of cult cinema studies. I mean, the students are willing to become filmmakers or film critics and historians.
Both. I mean,
yes.
I'm fortunate because I developed a film school template for Birmingham City University where I currently teach, and so if any of your viewers enjoyed The Quiet Revolution, I'd say they should give particular applause to the students who worked on that, many of whom were in their first year of studies. So we had students 18, 19 years of age who just arrived, who were then composing the soundtrack or doing the research or helping with the editing, which I'm really, really proud of them for. So the philosophy of the film school is that we talk about the idea of the critical maker, that we're not training, we don't want people to arrive and depart as filmmakers or to arrive and depart as film theorists. We want them to have an integrated approach to film, so they can theorize what they create, they can create it, but they have an awareness of the industry trends, which is why we're forever working with industry colleagues like Philip. I mean, Philip's been to BCU, he's worked there in a professional capacity, so it's really important we bring the industry in, as well as have an awareness of the historical debates.
Yes. And what about your festivals? Were they organized this year or postponed because of the COVID?
We're doing what you guys are doing. We're going. I mean, we're primarily going online. We're streaming in November for CineXS. We have been given a socially distanced screening space. So cinema spaces that would hold 100 and 120, we can have 35 people in. I've kind of booked them, but who knows if that's going to happen. I can't actually think it will. So we're probably, we are primarily focused on streaming, and we've got 3 days of conference activity and 14 films. So there's a lot of activity going on. And I'm pretty sure it's the same for Philip's Fractured Visions, which, Philip, is that December now?
It is indeed, sir, yes. So Fractured Visions will be over the weekend of December 5th and 6th, and all digital, and there's going to be 10 features, 10 short films, and a whole lot of Q&As, which starts actually tomorrow. I'm recording my first Q&A tomorrow, which is in Japan, actually. Really odd time, so yeah, I have to do a Q&A at 11 at night.
Xavier and Philip, do you plan any other documentaries, any maybe sequel to this one, or any other topics you would like to discuss?
Philip, I mean, it has a Rolodex of documentaries, and he'll probably tell you about some of those, and they're all amazing projects, which is why I'm really honoured to work with him. We're hopefully, it's always hopefully, we're looking for funding for next year for a new project, which is similar in a way to what you've just seen. The title of it is Scum of the Earth, and what Scum of the Earth is about is the constructions of whiteness within American horror cinema. So we'll be working with Kim Henkel, who wrote the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, who's kindly agreed to help us produce this. And it looks at the way in which white rural communities in American film have been portrayed across different timescales. And it traces that back to the eugenics movement of the 19th century, and argues that really when we see the hillbilly horrors that are even there today, what we're seeing is a representation of something that has a long historical standing. So if we can get the funding, it's always a big if, myself, Philip and Ernest will regroup and work on that. That's what I'm planning. Philip, I know you're finishing right now the found footage.
In production, sir, yes. So it's nowhere near as cool as the Scum of the Earth documentary at all. It's a documentary on the found footage phenomenon, and that's what it's called, the found footage phenomenon. And yeah, it's all about the subgenre that is, I like to think, this generation's slasher film, which is it's critically reviled. People, for the most part, hate them, but they're box office sensations. And yes, we're speaking to the people making these films and speaking to academics who are defending these films and finding out just exactly why people like them, because technically they shouldn't like them. There's like zero budget, there's zero activity going into these films, so they technically should not be successful, yet they are.
And if your viewers want to see a film that brings both of these debates together, the Scum of the Earth and found footage, there's a film that we're going to be screening at CineXS. It may have come out already there, that I think is quite interesting, called Gags the Clown, which is a found footage film about a clown that turns up in Wisconsin and terrorizes all the locals, and they send this kind of Trump supporting podcast presenter out to track them down, and there's lots of references to rurality and whiteness, so there's something going on here. So the found footage, as Phil says, it's really interesting because it sort of attaches itself to those wider debates in a really fascinating way.
Excellent. I want to thank you both, Xavier Mendik and Philip Escott, co-directors of The Quiet Revolution. I want to thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for participating in the festival. And I wish you all the best of luck in your upcoming projects and upcoming editions of your festivals. Thank you a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good night. Bye.